Hey guys, welcome to Egon Schiele in watercolor and gouache. So we're going to start today's class by doing Kneeling Female in an Orange Red Dress. So this is believed to be Egon Schiele's sister Gertrude, and it was painted in 1910. And in this, we see a lot of the features of Egon Schiele's early work. So his work sort of in the 1905 to 1910, very angular figures, lots of tension, lots of drama, sharp lines, and uneven brushstrokes. So to start this off, Egon Schiele did not use the best art materials. He was known for using, things that he found for packing materials, the cheapest kind of student art, watercolor paper. And for this, the background is some sort of cardboard. Now, since paper these days, even when we get the less expensive paper, it's generally bleached white, I'm just going to tone it down with some coffee. And I'm using a hog's bristle brush here. Now, this is not the brush that you usually associate with watercolors or gouache. This is a brush we usually use with oil paint. The hog's bristles are meant to pick up the paint, and they're less expensive in general than watercolor brushes, which especially in Schiele's time would have been made with, mink or Kolinsky squirrel animal fur. So hog's bristle brush are a cheaper medium. So I've just wet my paper down, and now I'm going to dry it with a hairdryer. Okay, so I've dried the paper. It's still lumpy, but I don't really mind. One of the most useful things to learn from Egon Schiele is that to make good art, you need to make a lot of it, and you can't be precious about the materials that you're using. He was not precious, and a lot of the vibrancy, the immediacy of his work comes from just how quickly he would work. He rattled off just hundreds upon hundreds of paintings. The collections are just full of them. And they're not very well preserved, a lot of them. I mean, there are just sheaves of them because he used the cheapest materials. He wasn't thinking about posterity. He was thinking about capturing the image. I'm going to start using a black charcoal pencil, but use graphite for this. I'm just doing this so it shows up on the screen. One of the key features of Schiele's work is angularity. So I'm going to start by creating a rectangle at the base I can fit the lower part of the figure into, more or less. Now, you'll want to keep these marks fairly light because we don't want to have to worry about too much erasing, but I'm just going to make these dark enough so you can see them. And I'm basically just creating two rectangles that I can fit the figure in. Now for the face, I could do that as a square probably. We want to think, okay, where's the chin in relation to this rectangle of the upper body? But other than that, I don't want to have to think about too much stuff. So I can see her hair's kind of coming out this way. I could make a box extending here. And for this, I'm just thinking, where would this intersect on the box? Where would the side of her face intersect? We've got that. Now for the hand, I'm just going to look at this angle, the fingers going sideways, and box out the kind of outer corners of the hand. At this point, I can start to sketch in the chin. This eye here is super important, so I want to make sure that that eye is well placed and dramatic, and at this point, I'll start to place that in, just because it's such a central feature of this ultra dramatic portrait. And if you take a look at your reference, the lips are kind of smiling up, and you'll each have a reference that you'll be able to work with. Now for the hands, I'm going to think about where the knuckles are. So I'm going to draw a line showing the row of knuckles and then I'm going to do circles for each knuckle. So 1, 2, 3, then a fourth one right here. And then I can see the knuckles up here. Schiele's models were very sort of often very thin, and this had to do with, of course, the time period that he was making these works in. And also, he tended to exaggerate bony features. But the early 1900s in Austria were a time of a lot of poverty. A lot of his models were emaciated. And unlike other artists that really did sort of an idealized form of beauty with sort of buxom figures, more similar to Victorian times, Egon Schiele was really revolutionary in the way that he created disturbing figures, figures that made you think of death and kind of the edges of human life instead of simply being beautiful. His figures were dramatic and somewhat disturbing, which was entirely new and which kind of separated his work from his mentor, Gustav Klimt, whose works were more romantic, more beautiful, even as they were angular. All right, so now I've got a bit of the face in, the eye in. Let's get a little bit of this hair in. So again, we're looking at angles, just really sharp angles on the outside of the figure to box out the hair. Let me just check this recording. Yep. And I can now start to use the face as a reference to just mark out where the folds of the dress are going to be. You've got an arm that's kind of hidden, but it's behind this arm here. Make a light line here to guide my marks. I'm using lighter pressure as I draft the folds in this dress because I want to have the ability to move them if I need to later. Portion, we want to think, okay, how far down does sort of the bum come in relation to the foot? And it's a little bit more than halfway down, so I'm going to move down here. We've got the thigh coming up to about here. We can start to carve into this box-like figure. Now this line here is actually probably a drafting mark that you've used to locate the knee. This is a really common way of mapping out a live figure. It's thinking of what's the angle from one part of the figure to the next. So my guess is that this was not a deliberate mark, but rather that was a drafting mark. And Schiele's works often go off the page. That creates even more of a sense of immediacy. All right, and now I'm going to get my palette together. Okay, so now I've got my palette together and it's time to start painting. We're using gouache today, and we're using gouache in a way that's both like a watercolor and like the gouache, which is which is an opaque medium. So today you're not going to learn how to use gouache precisely, either as a watercolor or as an opaque medium. You're going to learn how to use it like Schiele did, which is however he wanted to. I think it's a great lesson in the use of art supplies to kind of observe the work of an artist like this who really does not care about convention and how you're supposed to use supplies. Now, Schiele was really rough on his brushes, so we're using pretty rough brushes today. I'm going to start with a small flat brush and take some of the yellow ochre. Remember, like I said earlier, speed is an important element of painting like Schiele. Now, the way that I'm applying this gouache is I'm dipping my brush in water, dipping it in the paint, and then just kind of splashing on the paint in sections. Because I've used charcoal rather than graphite like you're going to be using in class, these colors are getting a little bit muddy as I move along, but it's not going to be a huge problem. And I'm going to just kind of scrub some of this color over the skirt. Now, Schiele, even though he was rough with his brushes, he did paint in between the lines. So he didn't just go completely crazy with it. Right, now that I've done that first wash, I'm going to dip my brush in water, add some more water to that burnt umber on my palette, and bring this across some of the knuckles. The hands, I'm going to darken up the top of her head a little bit, get a little bit of darkness under the eye. I'm almost purposefully holding my brush at an awkward angle to get these. And now I'm going to mix together both the burnt umber and the yellow ochre. Don't worry if your brush gets different colors on it as you go along. And I'm being really brutal to the brush. I'm pressing down way harder than I ought to. And I'm just scrubbing this paint over this area, not worrying about getting consistency. So I'm not worrying about getting it completely consistently opaque or completely consistent as a watercolor. I'm just placing it down as Schiele would with a bit of chaos. And I've got my red, which I've mixed with a bit of the yellow ochre to make a more warm yellow value that I'm going to just move into the cheekbones. I'm going to glaze this over. The knuckles, one thing that Schiele does is a lot of times you'll see knuckles and the bony spots are really red as they kind of move towards, as the skin kind of gets wrapped around the surface. He has figures that look cold because the extremities tend to have little bits of red on them. I'm just moving this red into this bow here. Made a cooler red, which is a mix of the red and a tiny bit of the Prussian blue. I can now use here. I'm going to glaze the tiniest bit of yellow over the eye to darken it. I want this area to be nice and dark. And I'm allowing the graphite to form part of the shading. Okay. And I'm just going to mix a teeny bit of that Prussian blue in with the yellow ochre. Get some yellowish shades. Whoops, that's very red. And take that off, but let's get some yellowish, sickly shades on this hand here. All right, so I'm going to move into the dress now using the bigger hog's bristle brush because I want the pigment to be really dramatic. And I'm going to use some of that red, plain cadmium red, using a little bit more opaque here because that's what he's done. And then I'm going to add water to that mix as I move up towards the sleeve here. And I'm going to use it more opaque. As you go along, you'll see that certain parts of this dress are more opaque in color, so I can just start by moving into the opaque areas. I'm being pretty random with the way that the brush is picking up color on my palette. So, you know, because we're doing a copy of his work, we want to get kind of the sense of the work. If you're too exact in trying to copy exactly everything that he does, you'll lose the brush strokes because he was working very quickly on this. So it's more important to get the style, the speed and velocity of his mark making, if you want to kind of reproduce his works, than it is to perfectly copy every element of the composition. And I'm moving into the back of the dress, using more kind of yellowish ochre colors back here. I'm adding more water to the brush. Now I'm going to scrub some of the yellow ochre into this area, and since my brush is already saturated with a fair amount of red, it's just going to mix, and then dipping the brush back into the red as I move over the lower part of her dress. Now moving back to the small brush, going to get a little bit of Prussian blue mixed with yellow ochre to make a slightly greenish tone, just to make a few accents of green. This is going to pop the red colors. And finally, let's move into the shoes. So this, I'm going to mix this blue with a little bit of the Prussian blue to make it a little bit darker. We move towards the bottom of the foot. And now for that very dramatic eye, I'll get just a little bit of white gouache to mix with the Prussian blue so I can come in and make a very dramatic blue eye. Oops. So I just put the blue of the eye in, and I'll use a little bit of that white to just whiten up the eye whites because I've gotten them a little bit too dark. And yeah, I'm going to leave it like that. And now I'm going to just kind of, if you want to move in with final details, you can. Like, you could put a little bit more of this yellow in the finger. It doesn't really matter that much though. Let me just move up here, get some darker blues in the hair while I have this brush on hand. And again, I'm being really awful to the brush. I'm just scrubbing it across the page. It's exactly the opposite of how you should use any nice brush. So that's why we're not using very nice brushes today. And let me move down to the foot. Okay, now I'm going to get the hairdryer, dry this completely, and I'm going to come in with a black crayon or a black charcoal pencil. I'll figure it out as I go along. You'll have a choice of supplies to use in the class to emphasize the outlines of the figure. Okay, so I've chosen a black colored pencil to work here, and I'm going to come a little bit more in front of the figure just so I can hold the pencil correctly. Now, Schiele he contains the chaos of his brush strokes in a second layer. My pencil's breaking because I'm pressing down very hard to get these really solid lines. So he contains this chaos of the brushwork with a very heavy second layer of line work that contains his marks. So the first level is uncontained, but then he doesn't allow his colors to move out of the lines. So let's get side of the hand here. And this is another reason why you don't want to really allow your brush to color everything in, because you want some clear spaces. I'm moving in with a really heavy line to outline dress. He was big on outlines, not before, but after the fact. And this just emphasizes the angularity of his forms. So I'm using a single line here. Just sharpening my pencil again before I move into the face. And I'm just going to make sure that I have this glowering expression. Whoops. This pencil is just flying. So black chalk would work for this. That's what was originally used. A black oil pastel. Placing in the eye, that really glowering stare. Oh, I forgot to do the lips. Well, I'm gonna just do the outside of the lips then, and then we'll color them in. Oh, that's not right. Right, and now finishing touches, I'm just going to fill in any areas that I missed, like the lips. And I'll use a finer brush for that. Also want to fill in this area here. Outlines, and I'll just bring this a little bit closer to the screen. So there we have it, our schiele-esque reproduction. You could come back in, put some more lines in, put some more tints of color. Like I'd probably darken up the reds over here, but that's enough. Let me just, actually, I'll do that just now. Again, he used his brush really roughly, but he nevertheless colored within the lines. And we can call it a day. Another thing that Schiele sometimes did, so we didn't do it here, but just so you have the option, is to emphasize the figure, he'd use a really heavy line of white along one on the outside. So for instance, he might trace one side in white. It's not really showing up on the screen too well. To create another level of accent for the figure. So I won't finish this, I'll just kind of go like this, but that's another option. Okay, so I hope that made sense. I know the video quality today is not ideal, but I left my webcam at home, and also in class, you'll have a closer look at this, of course. But here is our first Egon Schiele reproduction. I'll show you in class how to sign your name, sort of like him, if you want to kind of sign it. And there we go. So thanks for watching.